The moment I saw the envelope on the desk, I knew. The way Camilla's lips pressed together, eyes fixed on the monitor, made everything else fade. I stood there like an afterthought, 15 years of loyalty condensed into a sealed envelope that might as well have been a bomb. I didn't reach for it. I waited for her to speak, to give me a chance to redeem myself. But she didn't. Her voice was sharp, like the cut of cold steel. "Effective immediately," she said, not even glancing up from her screen. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't let it show. "You've been reassigned as an assistant liaison," she continued, each syllable a punch to the gut. My hands clenched at my sides. Assistant liaison, like a joke. The executive title I'd earned was gone, replaced by a position that belonged in a back office. My pulse thudded in my ears, but I refused to flinch. She didn't stop there. "Your compensation's been adjusted accordingly," she added, voice flat, like she was reading a weather report. 55% cut. No handshake. No warning. My knees felt loose. I'd given this company 15 years, late nights, early mornings, weekends spent drafting contracts, building teams, navigating crises that would have sunk lesser firms. I'd fought for her when no one else believed she could lead. And now she was gutting me like an obsolete program. "I'm promoting someone with stronger leadership instincts," she continued, her tone like ice. "Bryce Caldwell." The name hung in the air like poison. I'd seen the way she looked at him, how she leaned in just a little too close, how his grin always found its way to her lips. Bryce, the pretty boy with the perfectly rehearsed smile and no scars to show he'd fought for anything. I bit the inside of my cheek, felt the coppery tang of blood, but I stayed silent. She finally looked at me then. Her eyes cold and amused, like she was daring me to break. "You can leave if you can't accept it," she said, chin high, like she was offering me a lifeline. My heart raced. Leave? After everything I'd built? After every sleepless night and every client I cajoled into believing in us? The humiliation crawled up my spine, but I fought it down. I wanted to scream, to throw that envelope in her face, to remind her that without me she'd still be fighting for scraps. But I didn't. I smiled. I let the corner of my mouth turn up, a practiced grin that felt like armor. I said nothing because I knew something she didn't. I'd written Clause 47B. It was my lifeboat, the thing I'd crafted in a quiet hotel room in Berlin, while Camilla was too busy charming investors to notice I'd built a clause that no one could touch. A clause that said, operational oversight remains under Marcus Vance. Any reassignment voids contract. She hadn't read it. She hadn't even bothered. And Bryce? He was too busy smirking in boardrooms to understand the fine print that could set the whole house on fire. I picked up the envelope, its weight heavy in my palm like a coffin nail. I met her eyes, steady, calm. "Thank you," I said, my voice smooth as silk. She blinked, surprised. She was expecting me to beg, to cry, to shout. But I'd already won the moment she underestimated me. I turned on my heel, the office suddenly too small, too airless to contain what was coming. Each step felt like a countdown. The receptionist didn't meet my eyes. The interns at the copy machine avoided my gaze like I was a ghost, or worse, a failure. But they didn't know. None of them did. Because while they'd taken my title, they'd forgotten who wrote the foundation beneath their feet. My pulse steadied. My mind cleared. Clause 47B was more than a line in a contract. It was a promise I'd made to myself the night I'd watched Camilla smile at Bryce over dinner. It was the line that would bring them down. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped in, the hum of machinery drowning out the rage. I let it fade, let the resentment die in the space between floors. Because the next time I faced Camilla Vance, CEO of Halston Aerodyne, she'd remember who she underestimated. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing the boardroom that was no longer mine, the office I'd carved out of sweat and sacrifice. Let her take it. Let her wear my nameplate if she wanted. Because the true power wasn't in the corner office. It was in the clause she'd overlooked, the weapon she'd handed me without knowing. And when the time came to wield it, I'd be ready. The elevator dinged. I stepped out, the envelope still warm in my hand, my smile unwavering. They thought they'd demoted me. They'd just given me a front row seat to their own destruction. They gave me a cardboard box labeled Marcus Vance, Personal Effects, as if that was all I'd amounted to in 15 years. A box to carry my career in. I held it like a lifeline, the cheap cardboard edges already bending under the weight of my past. My nameplate had already been stripped from the executive door, no ceremony, no goodbye. The brass letters that had gleamed under my fingertips for a decade were probably in a dumpster somewhere, along with any respect I'd earned. I balanced the box on my hip, stepping into the elevator. No one met my eyes, not even the receptionist who used to greet me with that practiced smile every morning. She turned away, adjusting papers that didn't need adjusting. The elevator doors closed, and I caught my reflection in the stainless steel, rumpled suit. I was a little too tired. I straightened my tie out of habit, but it felt like armor for a battle that had already been lost. The doors opened on the ground floor, and I stepped into a lobby that used to feel like my kingdom. Now it felt like a corridor of judgment. People I'd hired, mentored, even shielded from layoffs and budget cuts, wouldn't meet my gaze. I didn't blame them. That's how corporate worked. Smile when you win, vanish when you lose. I let the silence settle over me like a cold rain. It was easier than confronting the truth that none of them really cared. I made my way to my new workspace, a corner cubicle behind a copier that rattled like a dying animal every time it spat out a page. The desk was sticky from old tape, and someone had left a half-empty coffee cup with a lipstick stain on the rim. I set my box down on the desk, feeling every mile I'd traveled, every hour I'd spent perfecting contracts, every night I'd given up to make this company stronger. 15 years, and now I was behind the damn copier. I pulled out my old nameplate, Marcus Vance, Vice President of Global Strategy, and stared at it like it was a relic from another life. I had built that title from scratch, from the days when Halston was a mid-tier parts supplier clawing at the feet of giants. I'd negotiated deals that put us on the map, made the Urava Jet contract a reality, a deal that had the potential to reshape the entire industry. And now that deal was being handed over to Bryce Caldwell like a birthday gift. The same Bryce who once told me he couldn't handle a red-eye flight because he needed his beauty sleep. The same Bryce who'd never put in the sweat equity to understand the regulatory frameworks, the supplier relationships, the delicate web of trust I'd built with partners across 3 continents. My phone buzzed, a notification from the internal HR system. I opened it, my thumb trembling just a little. "Welcome to your new role," it said. "Assistant Liaison, reporting to Vice President Bryce Caldwell." His name sat there like an insult, a black mark on every accomplishment I'd achieved. I scrolled further and saw my compensation details, slashed to the bone, a fraction of what I'd earned just last week. The anger came in a slow burn, rising from my gut like bile. But I forced it down because I couldn't afford to waste that energy. I had to stay focused. I had to remember what they didn't. Because amid all the humiliations, no nameplate, no handshake, no respect, there was one thing they'd overlooked. Clause 47B, page 114 of the Urava Jet contract. I'd embedded it there like a landmine, a safeguard for my own sanity. Operational oversight remained under Marcus Vance. Any reassignment without my consent would void the contract. They'd missed it. Every lawyer on the Halston team, every compliance officer, even Camilla herself. She was so busy plotting my downfall, so busy leaning into Bryce's perfect smile, that she hadn't even bothered to read the contract that had made this company's future possible. I could almost see Behringer's face. His meticulous signature on the dotted line, the way he'd patted my shoulder in that cafe in Paris and said, "Marcus, I trust you. Not Halston. You." I'd fought for that clause, knowing someday they might try to shove me out. And now here it was, my secret weapon, the lever that could bring the entire Urava Jet deal crashing down. I pulled the folder from my box, running my fingers over the worn edges. I'd read that contract so many times the pages felt like old friends. I found page 114, my notes scribbled in the margins from that night in the hotel lobby, the hours I'd spent alone while Camilla schmoozed investors and Bryce charmed reporters. Clause 47B was clear, no transition of oversight without my sign-off. No contract without my operational presence. I leaned back in the sticky chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. They thought they'd buried me behind the copier, but they'd handed me the match that could burn them to the ground. The copier whirred to life behind me, spitting out reports that no one would read. I watched the pages land in the tray like casualties. My name was nowhere on them. But that was fine, because when the dust settled, my name would be the one that mattered. I placed the Urava folder on the desk, my fingers resting on the Halston Aerodyne letterhead, feeling the weight of every signature that had failed to see the trap I'd set. They wanted me gone, erased from the halls I'd helped build. But they'd forgotten who taught them to fight. They'd forgotten who wrote the playbook. I closed the folder, placed it carefully back in the box, and leaned back. Let them celebrate Bryce. Let Camilla hold his hand and smile for the cameras. Because I wasn't gone. I was waiting. And they had no idea what was coming. Everyone celebrated the UravaJet deal like it was Bryce's personal victory parade. I watched from my cubicle behind the copier, my vantage point on the circus I'd once commanded. The screens on the executive floor glowed with the press conference. Camilla at the podium, hair perfect, voice polished, as if she'd orchestrated every detail herself. Bryce stood next to her, his smile wide and rehearsed, a hand on her lower back like he'd always belonged there. Reporters threw questions at him like confetti. What made you so successful? How did you manage to land the biggest contract in Halston's history? He answered with the confidence of a man who'd never missed a flight, never waited 6 hours for a connecting plane, never sat in a cramped boardroom in Munich convincing suspicious engineers that Halston Aerodyne was worth their trust. I'd been there, every step of the way, taking red-eye flights, rewriting jurisdictional frameworks, even pulling an all-nighter drafting the German liability language when their local counsel threw a tantrum over tax implications. Bryce had no idea what any of that meant. But here he was, basking in the glow of cameras, Camilla's hand on his shoulder, the headlines calling him the visionary leader behind the deal. I watched him on the screen as I sipped burnt coffee from the cafeteria, every word he spoke twisting like a knife in my gut. It would have been easy to stand up, storm the conference room, call them all frauds. But I didn't. I sat there, calm, hands folded, the contract folder unopened but close enough to feel its presence like a loaded gun. Because I knew what none of them did, page 114, clause 47b. The language was clear, the one line that no amount of PR spin could erase. Operational oversight shall remain under Marcus Vance. Any reassignment or substitution of leadership voids the agreement. I'd written that clause myself, hunched over a cheap desk in a Paris hotel while Berenger, the CEO of Urava, dictated his expectations in broken English. He looked me in the eye over a plate of lukewarm croissants and said, "Marcus, I want the man who built this, not some brand." That stuck with me. I'd insisted on that clause because I knew how corporate politics worked, how they'd slice your back open the minute they thought they could profit from it. And now here we were. The cameras rolled. Camilla beamed. Bryce smirked. And none of them knew they were holding a bomb with a lit fuse. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes on the screen, watching them pretend to be conquerors. The office around me buzzed with forced enthusiasm. Emails flying, memos sent, conference calls stacked like cheap plastic cups. Every time someone walked past, they'd avoid eye contact, or worse, give me that sympathetic smile that said, "Better luck next time, buddy." But they didn't know the game. They didn't understand that while they were busy rewriting the narrative, I'd already written the ending. The contract folder felt heavier than it should have, like it carried every sleepless night, every mile I'd flown, every fight I'd won to get Halston Aerodyne to the negotiating table with Urava. I'd built that deal from a rumor, chasing down every lead until it became a reality. When Camilla was too busy polishing her image, I'd been the one taking the hard calls, talking to Berenger's legal team, persuading them that we weren't just another contractor chasing a payday. I learned enough German to navigate the contracts myself, enough French to get us out of a disastrous regulatory mess in Paris. Every dotted I, every crossed T, I'd sweated over them. I'd given Halston everything. And now they'd handed it all to Bryce like it was his birthright. My phone buzzed. A push notification from the Halston app, "Congratulations to Vice President Bryce Caldwell for his outstanding leadership on the UravaJet deal." I stared at the screen, the bile rising in my throat. I forced a smile, even though no one was looking, because I knew they hadn't read page 114. They hadn't even skimmed it. They trusted me to get it signed, and I'd done that on my terms. I let the screen dim, my reflection fading in the glass, and for a moment I saw the man I'd been. The fighter, the strategist, the builder. I missed him, but he wasn't gone. He was waiting. I picked up the contract folder, running my fingers over the cover like a priest holding a Bible. Clause 47b wasn't just a clause. It was the key to everything. Without my oversight, the deal was worthless, a house built on sand. I'd written it with Berenger beside me, the two of us exhausted but determined. I'd explained it to him in simple terms. If they sideline me, you can walk away. No penalties. He laughed and signed. Because he trusted me, not Halston. Not Camilla. Not Bryce. Me. And that trust was the real currency in this game. I stood, the chair creaking beneath me, and glanced around the office. The buzz of printers, the hum of conference calls, the echo of laughter in the hallway, it all felt like background noise to the main event I'd engineered. They'd think they'd won. They'd think I was just a casualty of the corporate machine. But when the time came, and it would come, I'd remind them who wrote the rules. I tucked the folder under my arm and walked toward the copier, each step a beat of the countdown. They'd stolen my title. They'd paraded my victory like it was their own. But they'd forgotten who the architect was. And I'd make sure they remembered, page 114, clause 47b. The trap they'd set for me was the same one I'd laid for them. And when it snapped shut, it would be my name in the headlines. Not Bryce's. Not Camilla's. Mine. I showed up to work early the next morning, long before the first fake smiles or the smell of burnt coffee reached the executive floor. The office felt empty, hollow, like a shell waiting for the show to begin. My cubicle, tucked behind the rattling copier, was a box of stale air and fluorescent lights, but I made it my war room. I tucked in my shirt, adjusted my tie, and sat down with the composure of a man who'd already won the battle before the first shot was fired. They expected rage or resignation. They expected a man on the brink of tears, packing up his last shred of dignity and shuffling out the door. But I gave them presence, a quiet, immovable presence that they couldn't define or dismiss. I was the man who built the bridge they now danced across like it was their own parade. Camilla walked past my cubicle at 8:03 a.m. sharp, the click of her heels a rhythm I'd memorized over years of watching her glide into boardrooms like she owned the air itself. She didn't even glance my way. Her eyes were focused straight ahead, as if the copier and I were no more than a piece of cheap furniture. I watched her walk, chin high, hair perfect, every step rehearsed for an audience that didn't know she'd already lost. Bryce followed her at 8:06 a.m., his steps a fraction too quick, too eager. He'd adopted that grin, the one that said he was the future. He didn't spare me a glance either. But I saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted to the corners as if waiting for applause that never came. I didn't flinch. I didn't greet him, because the time for pleasantries had passed. I powered up my laptop, the screen illuminating my face like a beacon. Emails flooded in, internal memos, congratulatory notes to Bryce, meeting invites I'd been forgotten on. I clicked each one, scanning them for useful intelligence. My phone vibrated with reminders of meetings I wasn't invited to. But buried beneath the debris was the real treasure: strings of procurement schedules, engineering project timelines, old contacts who'd given me more than just their business cards. These were the people who'd kept Halston alive when the numbers dipped and the market shrank. I'd built relationships that Camilla and Bryce couldn't understand because they'd never been the ones to pick up the phone at 2 a.m. and calm a supplier in crisis. They'd never been the ones to talk an engineer out of a meltdown because a shipment was stuck at customs. I had, and those relationships were mine, even if Halston thought they'd bought them with my title. I started reaching out: emails, discreet messages, calls made from my personal phone. Procurement heads in Berlin, engineers in Toulouse, even that rival firm's legal analyst I'd once helped win a patent case in exchange for a quiet favor down the line. They remembered me. They remembered who had saved them from a contract dispute or a logistics nightmare. And when I explained, without bitterness, without accusation, that I was still here, that I still cared about the integrity of the deal we'd built together, they listened. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I was mapping weaknesses. Camilla thought she'd exiled me behind a copier, but she didn't understand that influence didn't live in corner offices. It lived in trust, in the handshakes you never forgot, in the late-night calls that reminded people they weren't alone. One by one, they told me things. Little things. Enough to sketch the outlines of a plan. A delay in a key shipment from Poland. A supplier in Spain who didn't trust Bryce's signature. An engineer in France who refused to sign off on a system upgrade without my final review. They hadn't read clause 47b, but they felt its weight in every hesitation, every signature left blank. My fingers flew across the keyboard, drafting notes, cross-referencing reports. Every detail fit together like a puzzle, one that Camilla and Bryce had no idea they'd left incomplete. Around 10 a.m., a message from a compliance officer popped into my inbox. Need your input on revised delivery schedules. Not sure Bryce is clear on the sequence. I nearly laughed. Of course he wasn't. He'd never been in the trenches, never waded through the bureaucratic hell of international logistics, never felt the panic of a contract on the brink. He'd been too busy perfecting his smile, and Camilla had been too busy using him to worry about the details that actually kept the lights on. I wrote back, polite but firm, happy to assist with clarifications. Please route all operational oversight queries through me per existing agreements. I didn't mention Clause 47B, but the weight of it hung between every line. I hit send and leaned back, the smile spreading across my face like a slow dawn. They'd thought they'd buried me behind a copier. But I was still the architect of this deal, the man Berenger had trusted, the man the engineers looked to for solutions when the system failed. And when the time came to remind Camilla and Bryce who held the keys, I'd do it not with shouting or threats, but with a signature and a clause they hadn't even bothered to read. The copier rattled beside me, spitting out reports that no one would care about. I watched the pages land, each one a testament to their arrogance. Let them celebrate their victory. Let them strut across the stage and call themselves conquerors. Because in the end, when the lights dimmed and the cameras turned away, they'd learn the truth the hard way. You can't steal the crown from the man who wrote the kingdom's laws. And I was still the law. On Thursday, I got a call from Isadora Kerr, the international contract attorney I'd met at a conference in Geneva 3 years ago. She was the kind of lawyer who read contracts like murder mysteries, every clause a potential clue to the killer's identity. She'd once saved my hide in a shipping dispute by finding a single misplaced comma that voided a competitor's entire claim. I trusted her because she never blinked at complexity and always told the truth, even when it hurt. The call came at 7:45 a.m., just as I was sipping the bitter coffee from the vending machine by my cubicle. The screen on my phone glowed with her name, and I answered on the first ring. "Marcus Vance," she said, her voice precise, the way it always was when something serious was at stake. "Yes," I said, forcing calm into my tone. The office around me was waking up, Bryce's voice echoing down the hall, Camilla's laughter somewhere near the executive suite. But this conversation felt like the only real thing in the entire building. "Marcus, I've been reviewing the Euravajet contract. Clause 47B," she said. I felt my heart give a little jump, like a sleeper startled awake. "It's airtight," she continued. "Legally, it's the strongest operational oversight clause I've seen in years." A wave of relief washed over me, so strong I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself. I'd known it was solid. After all, I'd written it ill. But hearing it from Isadora made it real, made it something I could use. "They didn't read it, did they?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She gave a small, dry laugh that made me think of boardrooms filled with clueless executives. "Marcus, they didn't even highlight it," she said. "Berenger did, though. His legal team flagged it, probably twice. He knows exactly what it means." I closed my eyes for a second, imagining Berenger's face. Sharp, pragmatic, a man who'd built his empire on not trusting anyone until they proved themselves. He'd trusted me, not Halston. Me. Because he knew I wouldn't bury him under half-finished promises. "Then you should know," Isadora continued. "It's about to blow their deal wide open." Her words hit me like an electric shock. The air felt charged, like a storm was rolling in. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the cracks in the ceiling tile, letting the weight of it sink in. The deal I'd built from scratch, the deal they'd tried to steal from me, was about to turn into a legal grenade. I could almost picture Bryce's face when the news hit, that smug grin faltering, his eyes darting to Camilla for rescue she couldn't give. "Isadora," I said slowly, "I need you to be ready to move on this. If they try to push it through without me, I want to make sure they understand the consequences." "Marcus," she replied, her voice firm, "the contract is yours to enforce. Halston can't finalize the deal without your oversight, no matter how many titles they throw at Bryce. You hold the keys." I let the words roll around in my head like marbles in a jar. I hold the keys. It wasn't revenge I felt. It was justice. All those years I'd spent building Halston from a mid-tier supplier into an international powerhouse. All those nights Camilla had left me to pick up the pieces while she chased investors and headlines. This was the payoff for every sacrifice. "Berenger knows," she added. "He's waiting for you to move. If you step up, he'll back you." The name Berenger carried weight. His voice in the international aviation world was stronger than any CEO's, stronger even than Camilla's carefully curated brand. If he decided the deal was invalid without me, it would collapse. and the $1.25 billion would vanish like smoke. Thank you, Isadora, I said, meaning every word. She'd always been more than a lawyer. She was a reminder that the system could work for the right person, that knowledge could be the blade that cut through any betrayal. I hung up and sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the desk like anchors. The office buzzed around me, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. I thought about the nights I'd spent in European airports, eyes red from lack of sleep, rewriting sections of that contract so it couldn't be undone by a single signature. I'd done that for Halston, for Camilla, and now they tried to erase me with a smile and a cardboard box. I pulled the contract folder from my bag and flipped it open, page 114 staring back at me like an old friend. The words were precise, each line a testament to my refusal to be disposable. Operational oversight shall remain under Marcus Vance. Any reassignment or substitution of leadership voids the agreement. I read it twice, letting the certainty of it sink into my bones. They'd thought I was powerless. They'd thought they could shuffle the deck and crown Bryce as king. But the real power had never been in a title. It was in the architecture of the deals I'd built, in the fine print no one cared to read. A thought struck me then, clear as the morning sun. They'd built their empire on my shoulders, and they'd forgotten to check the foundation. I'd been the architect, the mason, the inspector, the damn landscaper, and they'd assumed the house would stand without me. I stood, closing the folder with a quiet snap, feeling the surge of adrenaline that comes when you realize the war is already won and all that's left is to watch the enemy's walls crumble. I gathered my notes, every scrap of information I'd collected in the last few days, every call I'd made, every whisper I'd caught in the hallways. I would turn them into a weapon more potent than any boardroom argument, the truth. The truth that Halston's shining deal rested on my signature, my oversight, my relentless work ethic. And I'd made sure that without me, they couldn't close the deal. The image of Bryce boarding a private jet to Toulouse flashed through my mind, first-class ticket, custom briefcase, the media waiting at the other end to crown him the new king. I almost pitied him. Almost. Because he didn't know the door would be locked, that his badge wouldn't scan, that he'd be the man holding the torch at a funeral he couldn't even attend. I reached for my phone and dialed Behringer's direct line. He answered on the second ring, his voice as calm and assured as ever. "Marcus," he said, "I've been waiting to hear from you." "Behringer," I replied, feeling my voice steady. "I wanted to assure you that Clause 47B still stands. Any attempt to transition this deal without me is void, and I'm ready to stand by that clause." There was a pause, and then he laughed, a deep, satisfied sound that carried the weight of decades of boardroom battles. "I knew I chose the right man," he said. "They thought they could replace you with a child and a smile. But the deal was with you, Marcus. You have my full support." I hung up and exhaled. The copier rattled behind me, the screen flickering with endless reports no one would read. I didn't need to read them. I had my proof, my leverage, my signature. And tomorrow, when the doors locked on Bryce and Toulouse and Camilla's kingdom started to crack, I'd be the one holding the only key that mattered. And for the first time in weeks, I let myself smile. A real smile, sharp and dangerous. Because they'd underestimated me. And that was their last mistake. Camilla had always believed in grand gestures. That's why she sent Bryce to France to handle the post-deal transition. First-class ticket, custom leather briefcase, even a send-off at the executive lounge with sparkling water and cameras flashing like he was some celebrity instead of a puppet. The headlines followed him out of the country. Young visionary takes charge. Halston's new era. Bryce Caldwell's strategic genius. Every word felt like a knife, but I let them print it all. Let them celebrate his coronation. Because every step he took brought him closer to the trap I'd set with my own hands, hidden in the fine print they'd been too busy smirking to read. I pictured him in that first-class seat, legs stretched out, probably rehearsing his talking points and imagining himself as the new king of the aviation world. He'd spent months charming reporters, flashing that perfect grin at every opportunity. I'd watched him in boardrooms, his hands folded just so, head tilting at the right angle, the practiced humility. But that was the thing about Bryce, he was all posture, no spine. The real work, late nights, calls at 3 a.m. to suppliers on the verge of walking away, emergency flights to Munich to smooth over a missed detail, he'd never done any of it. That was my sweat on the contracts, my name in the small print, my fingerprints on every page. At 10:12 a.m. Toulouse time, Bryce walked into the glass and steel headquarters of Urava Aerospace, briefcase in hand, hairstyled like he was posing for a corporate ad. I knew the exact time because Behringer had texted me himself. "He's here," he'd written, but his badge didn't scan. The smile that spread across my face then felt like justice itself. All those years, I taught myself to stay calm, to smile even when they spat in my face. But this was different. This was my moment. Bryce tried the badge again and again, probably cursing the tech staff, oblivious to the real reason the door wouldn't open. At 4:26 p.m. France time, an email left Urava's legal department with one subject line: Clause 47B, deal suspended. The message hit Halston's system like a bomb. I imagined Camilla in her glass office, phone pressed to her ear, voice trembling as she realized the billion-dollar deal she'd paraded around like a trophy was now a crumbling house of cards. All because she hadn't bothered to read the contract I'd written. My phone buzzed with 100 notifications, some from compliance officers, some from finance, but most from the same executives who'd avoided eye contact in the halls. They wanted answers now. They wanted me to fix what Bryce and Camilla had broken. I leaned back in my cheap chair behind the copier, the same chair that had become my fortress. I sipped my coffee slowly, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. This was why you never let your guard down. This was why you never gave away your power without a fight. I'd spent too many nights with that contract, red pen in hand, hunting every loophole that could leave us exposed. I'd written Clause 47B for a moment just like this, so that if they ever tried to push me out, they'd pay for it. They hadn't seen it coming. They'd been too busy planning their headlines and crafting their speeches to understand that the foundation they were standing on had been poured by me, and I'd left the dynamite with the fuse already lit. The media didn't know yet, but the internal emails were already frantic. Compliance was panicking. Legal was pointing fingers. I could almost hear the shouts from the executive floor, the sound of Camilla's voice rising as she demanded to know how this could happen. Bryce was still in France, probably standing outside the glass doors with his perfect suit and no way inside. That image gave me more satisfaction than any title ever could. I opened my laptop and watched the messages come in. "Marcus, what's going on? Marcus, can you help? Marcus, this is urgent, call me." My name was everywhere again. The same people who treated me like a ghost 2 days ago now wanted me to be their savior. I let them stew, because this wasn't about quick fixes. This was about showing them what it meant to underestimate the man who'd built the company they'd tried to steal. I clicked open the official email from Urava's legal team, my eyes skimming the familiar language. As per Clause 47B, operational oversight remains under Marcus Vance. No reassignment or substitution of leadership without his consent. Pending resolution, all contract activity is suspended. The words were like music. Every line was a reminder that I'd been the architect of this deal, and no one could sign me away like a used car lease. I hit reply all and typed, "I will review this and respond with an official position tomorrow." In the meantime, I remind everyone that Clause 47B stands. I remain the point of contact for any operational oversight. I press send, feeling the power settle in my chest like a live wire. I'd let them sweat overnight, let them replay every time they'd smirked at me, every time they'd passed me in the hall without a glance. Because tomorrow, they'd come crawling back, and I'd decide who got back in. As the office buzzed with panic, I leaned back and let the moment wash over me. The headlines would come soon enough. Halston deal in jeopardy. Clause 47B halts $1.25 billion contract. Marcus Vance holds the keys. And when they did, Camilla and Bryce would finally understand that they hadn't built this empire on their charm or their titles. They'd built it on the sweat of a man who'd never stopped fighting for the company he believed in, even when it turned its back on him. I took another sip of my coffee, the bitter taste a reminder that sometimes victory didn't come with fanfare. Sometimes it came with the quiet satisfaction of watching the house of cards fall, one smug smile at a time. Let Bryce enjoy his flight to failure. Let Camilla scramble for answers. Because I was no assistant. I was the architect, and they were just players in the game I'd already won. By morning, panic had spread like fire on the executive floor. I didn't have to be up there to see it. I could feel it in the way the emails flooded in, each one more frantic than the last. Legal was scrambling, compliance was flailing, and every single one of them was looking for someone to blame. I sat in my cubicle, the hum of the copier like background music to the chaos above. My phone buzzed with calls I didn't answer. I watched the names scroll across the screen. Some I'd mentored, others who'd smiled at me while slipping knives in my back. Let them sweat. Let them remember that in the corporate jungle, the man who controlled the contract controlled the game. I opened my inbox and found a message from an old friend on the executive floor. Robert Hadley, the CFO, a man I'd once saved from a disastrous quarterly call by working through the night to patch up a revenue leak. His message was simple. Robert's blaming legal. Camilla's losing it. Bryce cried in the men's room. I read it twice, then let out a slow, satisfied breath. The fortress they'd built on press releases and magazine interviews was crumbling, and I hadn't had to lift a single finger. Just let Clause 47B do what I designed it to do. My phone rang again, vibrating across the sticky surface of my desk. It was Robert this time, his name flashing like an SOS. I let it ring, because power didn't answer panic. It let the panic find its own level. I scrolled through the latest reports from Toulouse. Bryce had been denied entry to the facility. Behringer's team had issued a statement confirming operational oversight rested with me. Camilla's face, drawn tight, had appeared on the conference call to Urava's legal team. Her smile gone, her eyes darting like a cornered animal. I pictured her voice, usually so calm and commanding, cracking under the weight of her own arrogance. A memo from compliance hit my inbox at 9:13 a.m. Marcus, we urgently need to discuss Clause 47B implications. Please advise. I leaned back in my chair and let the satisfaction settle. They were finally seeing what I'd tried to tell them all along. Contracts weren't just paperwork. They were architecture, and I was the one who'd built the foundation they'd neglected to inspect. It wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. Respect they'd denied me when they stripped my title and handed my life's work to Bryce. I thought about the days I'd spent hammering out the details of that contract, every detail refined and cross-checked with Isadora. I'd built Clause 47B like a fortress, a last line of defense against exactly this kind of betrayal. Now it was standing tall, the one thing they couldn't talk their way around. At 10:01 a.m., a board member finally spoke. Geraldine Chase, a woman I'd known for years, shrewd, calculating, never one to mince words. Her message came through as a short, formal email. Robert and Camilla sidelined Marcus because they thought he was too powerful, not because he failed. I read it 3 times, each word like a blade slicing through the fog of corporate spin. Geraldine had always seen the truth, even when she chose not to say it. Her message was a signal, a quiet acknowledgement that the game had changed. I pictured the boardroom, then Camilla at the head of the table, eyes red from lack of sleep, voice trembling as she tried to spin a narrative that no longer fit the facts. Bryce slouched beside her, the golden boy now tarnished, the tears still drying from his moment in the men's room. And Robert. His voice strained, his spreadsheets useless in the face of Clause 47B. They'd underestimated me. They'd assumed the man who'd worked weekends, who'd picked up every dropped call and fixed every crisis, would just slink away to his corner cubicle and fade into obscurity. But I'd always been more than a title. I'd been the architect of their success, and now I was the architect of their downfall. I replied to Geraldine's email with a single line. Thank you for acknowledging the truth. Because that was the most powerful weapon I had now, truth. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to shout. I'd let the silence speak for me, let the weight of their own decisions drag them down. The chatter in the office was different now. People whispered when I passed, their eyes darting away when I looked at them. The interns who'd once ignored me now stood a little straighter, unsure if they should smile or flee. I moved through the office like a ghost they couldn't dismiss. Because I'd made myself indispensable, and now they were starting to see it. I paused at the window by the copier, looking out at the skyline I'd fought so hard to build. Every deal I'd closed, every client I'd convinced, every sleepless night spent crafting solutions to problems no one else wanted to touch, it was all there, etched into the glass and steel. And now, thanks to their arrogance, they were about to watch it all teeter on the brink. I felt a flicker of sadness then. A momentary pang for the team we could have been, the empire we could have built together if they'd only trusted me instead of undermining me. But that was gone now, and I'd accepted it. All that remained was the reckoning. When noon came, I gathered my notes, the contract folder with Clause 47B highlighted in neon yellow, and walked past the copier to the elevator. I took the long ride up to the executive floor, every second ticking like a drumbeat. The doors opened on a hush of voices, a tension so thick it felt like smoke. I walked in, folder in hand, and paused at the glass doors of the main conference room. Camilla looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. Bryce didn't meet my gaze. Robert looked at me like a man hoping I'd save them from themselves. I stepped into the room and set the folder down on the table. Clause 47B stared at them like a judge. I didn't speak right away. I let the silence stretch, let them squirm. Because power didn't need a microphone. It needed only the truth. And the truth was, I'd written the clause they'd ignored. I'd built the deal they'd tried to steal. And now, I was the only one who could keep them from losing it all. And in that silence, I saw something I'd waited years to see: recognition in Camilla's eyes. The look of a queen who'd realized her kingdom was built on a single man's signature. And that man was me. Friday, 9:15 a.m. My phone rang. I'd been staring at the contract folder on my desk, the neon highlight on Clause 47B bright, even in the weak morning light. The ring startled me, sharp and insistent. I picked it up without checking the caller ID. Marcus Vance, I said, keeping my tone measured. I'd learned that in this world, composure was currency. Marcus, it's Jonah Patel. His voice had that calm urgency I'd always respected. Jonah, from Avanex Global, the international powerhouse that had tried to lure me away months ago with promises of authority, resources, and, most tempting of all, respect. I leaned back, cradling the phone against my shoulder. Jonah, I said, as if this was just another Friday call. But my heart quickened. Avanex was the big leagues, where Halston had always been a battleground of egos and hidden knives. Avanex played the game at a higher level. And they'd offered me a chance to build something truly mine. We made you an offer months ago, he said, and I could almost see his expression, a mix of calculation and a hint of camaraderie. He'd always known I was the key Halston didn't know how to use. I remember, I said, keeping my voice even, but inside, a spark flared. That offer had been tempting, but back then I'd still believed I could change Halston from the inside. Now I knew better. Jonah's voice dropped, the way it does when a man wants to ensure you hear the weight behind the words. We'd like to double it. My breath caught, but I didn't let him hear it. Double it? That wasn't just an offer, that was a declaration. Full authority, he continued. Your own team. And something else. He paused, letting the silence sharpen the edge of his next words. Behringer requested you personally. He said, we don't deal with brands. We deal with builders. The words hit me with the force of a freight train. Behringer, the man who'd trusted me in that Paris cafe, who'd signed Clause 47B without blinking, wanted me. Not Halston. Not Camilla. Me. Because he knew that deals weren't inked by titles or corporate slogans. They were built by sweat, strategy, and the kind of relentless drive that couldn't be faked in a boardroom presentation. I let the silence stretch for a moment, enough for Jonah to wonder if I was weighing his words. The truth was, I'd known for days that this call would come. I'd known the moment Behringer refused to let Bryce through the door that the power dynamic had shifted. Camilla and Bryce had played the game of appearances. I'd played the game of substance. And substance always won, even if it took time. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully. But I'm not coming over unless I have the authority to build this the right way. No micromanagement. No boardroom politics. I want oversight, full-cycle leadership, and the right to hire my own team. My heart beat faster, but I kept my voice calm. This was my moment, and I wouldn't let the weight of it slip through my fingers. Jonah didn't hesitate. Marcus, you've got it, he said, his tone decisive. Full-cycle leadership. Your own hires. Operational autonomy. Behringer's already signed off on it. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the moment sink in. This was what every late night, every red-eye flight, every sleepless negotiation had been leading to. Not a demotion in a corner cubicle. Not a stolen title. This. My own team. My own empire. Then let's finalize it, I said, my voice steady, even as adrenaline thrummed in my veins. I'll have my lawyer review the contract, but I want the deal closed by Monday. I could practically hear Jonah's smile. Done, he said. Welcome to Avanex, Marcus. Behringer will be thrilled. I hung up and stared at the contract folder on my desk, Clause 47B highlighted like a victory banner. They tried to bury me. Tried to hand my legacy to a man who didn't even know the difference between a term sheet and a delivery schedule. And now? Now I just secured a future they couldn't touch. A billion-dollar deal, with my name on every signature line. I stood, feeling a lightness in my chest that I hadn't felt in weeks, maybe months. I looked around the cubicle, the sticky desk, the rattling copier, and for the first time, I felt no anger, just clarity. Halston had taught me everything I knew about building deals, about fighting for respect in a world that didn't hand it out freely. But it had also taught me that loyalty was a one-way street if you let it be. They'd mistaken my dedication for weakness, and that was their biggest mistake. I gathered my notes, the contract folder, my phone. I'd let them have the copier. Let them keep the corner office that no longer meant anything. Because power wasn't in a nameplate or a fancy desk. It was in the relationships I'd built, the respect I'd earned, and the one clause they'd never seen coming. Clause 47B had been my lifeline, but now it was my key to the future. I walked past the copier, past the interns who looked at me like I'd grown wings, past the managers who'd once smiled politely while plotting my demise. Let them watch. Let them remember that the man they'd demoted was the man who'd saved them from themselves more times than they could count. And now he was leaving, with the deal they'd thought was theirs in his pocket. As I stepped into the elevator, I felt my phone buzz again. A text from Camilla. "Can we talk?" it read. I stared at it for a moment, my thumb hovering over the reply button. I thought about the years we'd spent building Halston, the nights I'd carried her through crises, the times I'd stayed up rewriting contracts while she courted investors with that smile of hers. I thought about how she looked at me the day she demoted me, like I was an obstacle she needed to step over to reach her throne. I thought about the way she'd handed my legacy to Bryce without blinking. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. Because power didn't argue. It moved on. I stepped out of the building, the morning sun bright on my face, the city humming with possibility. I was done being the man behind the scenes. Done waiting for the respect I'd earned. I had my future now, my team, my authority, my name at the top of the Letty-off Halston behind. Because I was no assistant or head. And this time, I built the kingdom myself. I took a deep breath, the air crisp and clean, and walked forward, leaving the copier, the cubicle, and the ghosts. I was Marcus Vance. And I was finally free to be the man they'd been too blind to see. 2 weeks later, I sat in Avanex's Manhattan boardroom, sunlight streaming in through the floor-to-ceiling windows like a spotlight on the future. The air smelled like leather chairs, freshly brewed coffee, and the clean, unvarnished potential that only comes when you know your worth. I had a pen in my hand, an executive fountain pen, weighty, expensive, the kind that left a mark you couldn't erase. In front of me lay the revised contract for the Euravajet deal, a contract that bore the mark of every sleepless night I'd spent shaping its clauses and bulletproofing its vulnerabilities. The figure at the bottom of the page, $1.25 billion, gleamed like a trophy, but it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the line that read, "Executive Oversight, Marcus Vance. No substitutions permitted." I read it twice, letting every syllable sink in. I'd fought for this. Not just with contracts and lawyers, but with every ounce of patience and strategy I'd learned over 15 years in boardrooms where smiles were weapons and handshakes sometimes hid daggers. I'd survived Camilla's betrayal, Bryce's smirk, and the corporate machine that thought it could bury me with a cubicle behind a rattling copier. I'd taken their demotion and turned it into a throne they couldn't touch. Now here I was, pen poised, a boardroom full of Avanex's top brass watching me like they were seeing the future unfold. I could feel their anticipation, the way they leaned in, as if my signature would summon the very aircraft from the ground. I glanced at Jonah Patel, seated across from me, his hands folded like a man who already knew the answer. He'd championed me from day one, fighting for the deal even when his own board had questions about why we needed Marcus Vance so badly. But Behringer had been the real push. He'd made it clear to Avanex that this deal wasn't with Halston, wasn't with Camilla's marketing machine. It was with me. And when Behringer spoke, people listened. "Take your time, Marcus," Jonas said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. "This is your legacy now. And your future." I looked around the table, executives in tailored suits, each one weighing their own ambitions against the tide of change I'd brought with me. They weren't used to men like me. Men who didn't play politics with smiles and dinner parties, but instead built empires with quiet diligence and relentless strategy. I uncapped the pen and placed the tip against the paper. My hand didn't tremble. It felt like the culmination of every late night, every cross-continental flight, every deal I'd pulled back from the brink. I wrote my name in a deliberate, measured script, Marcus Vance. And as the ink dried, so did the last traces of the man they'd tried to bury behind that copier. That man was gone. In his place stood the architect of Halston's greatest deal, and now Avanex's crown jewel. At 10:30 a.m. sharp, the press release went live. I watched Jonah's assistant hit the send button, her eyes wide like she knew this was more than a press release. It was the end of an era, and the beginning of mine. I imagined the moment Camilla saw it, her phone buzzing in the middle of an investor call, her smile freezing as she read the headline. Avanex Global secures exclusive oversight of Urava jet deal under Marcus Vance. My name, my terms, no substitutions. The deal they thought they'd stolen from me had come full circle. And now it was mine, untouchable. Bryce would never show his face again. I pictured him somewhere in his overpriced condo, his custom briefcase gathering dust in a corner, the headlines about his bright future replaced by silence. I didn't need to hear from him. His time in the sun had lasted as long as the applause, and now the spotlight had shifted. I didn't hear from Camilla either. Not at first. But later that afternoon, as I was reviewing the first wave of congratulatory emails from industry leaders and suppliers I'd worked with for years, my phone buzzed with a message that made me pause. "Can we talk?" That was all it said. No apology. No explanation. Just 3 words. I stared at them for a long moment, feeling a mix of pity and disdain. She'd always known how to ask the right question when it suited her. But the time for questions had passed. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my jacket pocket. Because power didn't negotiate with the past. It signed its own contracts and moved forward. I leaned back in my chair, letting the satisfaction settle deep in my bones. This was what victory felt like. Not a standing ovation or a champagne toast, but the quiet knowledge that I'd played the long game and won on my terms. The boardroom around me hummed with energy. Avanex's team was already talking about expansions. New contracts, new alliances, global growth. And at the center of it all was my name, etched in stone, a signature that couldn't be erased. I thought about Halston then, the office I'd left behind, the people who'd thought they could replace me with a younger, flashier version. I pictured the empty corner office, the rattling copier, the interns who'd learned to avert their eyes when I passed. I didn't feel rage. I felt restoration, because every empire that collapses leaves behind a blueprint. And I'd taken mine and built something stronger. I stood, smoothing the lapels of my suit, feeling the eyes of Avanex's team on me. "Thank you, everyone," I said, my voice carrying the weight of every silent night I'd spent fighting for this moment. "Let's make sure Urava knows they made the right choice." Jonah smiled, a genuine smile that said he knew I meant every word. Because that was the difference between me and every other executive who'd sat at this table. I didn't sign deals to chase headlines. I signed them to build legacies. As the meeting adjourned, I stepped into the hallway, the glass walls of the boardroom reflecting a man I barely recognized. Gone was the assistant liaison. Gone was the man who'd been demoted without a glance. In his place stood Marcus Vance, Chief Global Officer. My name, in the font that mattered most. My signature, on the deal that changed everything. And the knowledge that no one could take that from me ever again. I walked out into the Manhattan sunlight, the city humming with its own rhythm. I thought about the years ahead, the contracts waiting to be negotiated, the teams waiting to be built. I thought about the legacy I'd leave behind, not as the man behind the copier, but as the architect of deals that would outlast the headlines. And as I crossed the street, I felt the weight of my old life slip away. Because I wasn't just signing contracts anymore. I was signing my name in stone. And that was the kind of victory no one could take away. 3 months later, I walked into the new Avanex headquarters in D.C. with a sense of quiet authority that no title could bestow and no corner office could contain. The building rose like a monument to possibility, glass, steel, and the hum of ambition. My name was etched on the main conference room door in gold lettering. Chief Global Officer, Marcus Vance. I paused for a moment, letting the weight of that name sink in, the culmination of every red-eye flight, every sleepless night rewriting contracts, every betrayal I'd endured and turned into fuel. I'd left Halston in the rearview mirror, but its lessons remained. That morning, Halston Aerodyne had just announced 200 layoffs and the resignation of Robert Hadley. The news spread like wildfire across the industry blogs, the chatter of analysts buzzing with speculation about the company's future. Camilla's boyfriend, Bryce Caldwell, the man they'd crowned king in my place, had been quietly reassigned to a role in sales support. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The house of cards they'd built on my foundation had collapsed on its own. I stepped into my office, a space that was sleek, modern, but grounded. No garish displays of wealth or power, just clean lines and the quiet confidence of a man who'd earned his place. The walls held framed photos of aircraft I'd helped bring to market, a map with red pins marking every city I'd negotiated in, every contract I'd signed. It wasn't about trophies or headlines. It was about legacy. My legacy. And I'd build it with my own hands. I sat at my desk and pulled up the latest report on the Uravajet project, now officially under my oversight, just as Clause 47B had always intended. Every milestone, every challenge, every triumph, my team reported directly to me. The engineers who had once feared corporate politics now worked with a clarity of purpose, knowing I had their backs. The procurement teams who'd once been overruled by clueless executives now had a leader who understood their value. I read the report carefully, making notes in the margins. No detail was too small to matter. That was what had set me apart at Halston, and what had ultimately brought me here. A knock sounded at my door. I looked up to see Jonah Patel, his face lit with that quiet satisfaction that comes from seeing a plan executed flawlessly. He'd been instrumental in getting me here, but he'd also known when to step aside and let me lead. That respect ran deeper than any contract. "Marcus," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "I thought you'd like to know, Halston's board just announced an external audit. Investors are circling like sharks." I leaned back in my chair, the news settling like a final punctuation mark on a story that had started the day Camilla tried to erase me. "They built their empire on a lie," I said, voice calm, even. "Sooner or later, it was going to crumble." Jonah nodded, his eyes sharp. "And you're the man who built the deal they tried to steal." Urava is fully on board. Behringer's team couldn't be happier. Every conversation they have about this project starts with your name. "You've done more than reclaim your reputation, Marcus. You've defined it." I let that sink in, because it was true. I'd spent years fighting to be recognized not just as a good negotiator, but as a builder, someone who didn't just close deals but made them unbreakable. At Halston, they'd taken that for granted. At Avanex, they'd made it the cornerstone of their future. "Thanks, Jonah," I said, standing to shake his hand. "For everything. You took a risk on me, and I won't forget that." He smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "You didn't need luck, Marcus. You just needed a place that saw what you're really worth." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. I almost forgot. Camilla's been calling the press, trying to spin her exit as a strategic pivot. "Just thought you'd want to know." I felt a flicker of something, pity maybe. Camilla had always been the master of appearances, but in the end, appearances couldn't outlast the truth. I'd written Clause 47B, and it had saved the deal. But more than that, it had saved me. From a life spent waiting for recognition from people who never really saw me. I was done waiting. I was done asking. I'd built the future with my own hands. I turned to the window, the city stretching out below like a map of all the possibilities I'd once thought out of reach. Every mistake, every betrayal, every demotion had led me here, to a place where my name wasn't just on a door, but on the future itself. I thought about the years at Halston, about the late nights Camilla had spent charming investors while I'd stayed back drafting contracts no one bothered to read. About the day she'd handed my job to Bryce without a second thought. About the smirk on his face when he'd told me he was taking things in a new direction. That smirk was gone now, and so was he. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text from an old colleague still trapped at Halston. "They're calling it the Vance effect. Even the auditors know you were the backbone of the Urava deal. Wish you'd been here to see them scramble." I smiled. Not a smile of triumph or revenge, but of quiet satisfaction. Because they'd underestimated me. They thought they could erase me, but they'd only taught me to build my own kingdom. And now it stood taller than any tower they'd ever dared to imagine. I turned back to my desk, pulled up the next project on my screen, and started planning. Because that's what builders do. They move forward. They create. They define the future on their own terms. And I had plenty of future left to write.